Hi guys, it's Debbie, and encouraged by one of you guys who suggested I should make a video about my hidden gem movies, I decided to make another one of these videos about lesser known films I think you should watch. Hopefully it won't be too long, although I have a lot to cover and I'm sure I'll think about plenty more films as soon as I finish recording this, so grab a tea, coffee, snack, because we're going to dive into a lot, and unfortunately I won't be able to linger too much on every single movie, otherwise it definitely would be too long. Now, whenever anybody tries to cover this topic, suddenly it becomes a competition at who has seen the most obscure film possible. I'm not trying to be performative here, I don't want to beat anyone. These are just films that I personally really enjoyed and I think received a fraction of the attention that they deserved. And of course, I'd love to hear in the comments what you think about them and what other films you think deserve more attention. Now, I think I'll kick things off maybe with not the wildest of films, but with the country that started this whole discussion, and that is Bhutan. So here are two great Bhutanese films, Agent of Happiness and Lunana, a Yak in the Classroom. You probably already heard me talk about Lunana various times in the past because I enjoyed it so much. It's the story of a teacher who travels to one of the most remote schools in the world, literally the most remote school in the world, to teach the children who live there, who in the film are actually the real children from the village of Lunana. The film explores how important education is to them, but also how differently the villagers see the world and what they value. It really makes you think about how our perspective on what counts as a problem can be completely different depending on where and how we live. And this idea of perspective and what we consider happiness returns with the other film I watched, Agent of Happiness. It's actually a documentary about Bhutan's attempt to calculate national happiness by sending government agents across the country to ask people a series of questions about their lives and what contributes to their happiness. So not only is it interesting to see what other people consider an important factor in their happiness, but of course, speaking about happiness means necessarily opening up about your fears, about your regrets, and the things that make you sad. And as someone who has been struggling with coming to terms with the bittersweetness of life, with the idea that when you love, you also inevitably open yourself up to suffering, and with trying to understand what actually makes me happy, these films really meant a lot to me. There's another Bhutanese film I've been wanting to see for a very long time, and that is The Monk and the Gun, so I guess it's time for that now. Instead, a film I saw a few months back and I don't think received a fraction of the attention it deserved is A Missing Part. Believe me, people were crying in the cinema when I watched this, myself included. It's inspired by the stories of people who lost custody of their children in Japan because of how Japanese law works. The protagonist is a Frenchman living in Japan who, after a difficult divorce and years of not seeing his daughter, finally manages to find her. And of course, that opens up years of wounds and unsolved emotions. We see the situation from a different perspective, the consequences of the custody system, and all the complicated feelings surrounding it. Unfortunately, I think this movie was quite popular in France, but never really managed to expand a lot beyond that. I then recently watched I Am That Girl. It had been on my watch list for a crazy long time. I genuinely have no idea how it ended up there in the first place, and I even discovered it starred Pedro Pascal. Actually, then reading more about this film, I realized a lot of people watch it basically just to complete Pedro Pascal's filmography. It starts off as this very Y2K light story about a party-loving, materialistic woman who gets herself into debt by spending all her money on clothes, drinking, partying, but then she ends up befriending a man who is the complete opposite of her. I'm talking the kind of person who goes hiking on a weekend for fun, and the way this friendship develops had me laughing out loud, crying in the next scene. I genuinely think you should watch it regardless of Pedro Pascal. This is the kind of film that shows how you don't need a massive budget to create genuine human emotions. Next in my notes, and we're skipping all over the place here, is Osama, in which the director picked an actual girl begging on the streets of Kabul as the lead actress. He didn't use somebody who was already in the industry, and the film tells the story of a girl living in a society where women are not allowed to work or study, who is forced to pretend to be a boy in order to provide for her family. This means going to extreme lengths to hide her identity, and the film deals with some incredibly difficult topics involving feminism, humiliation, oppression. Still to this day, over 20 years later, the lead actress Marina Golbahari lives abroad receiving death threats, so it's understandably not a light subject, but a very well-made film. Next is Is Purest White, which I watched during a bit of a Jia Zhangke phase. I also watched Mountains May Depart, and I want to watch Still Life and caught by the tides. Is Purest White is a story spanning many years involving a Chinese woman who is imprisoned for reasons I won't spoil, but during a time in which China was going through a massive change, and when she's eventually released, she finds herself in a country that feels completely different from the one she left behind, so she has to rebuild her life while navigating all these enormous changes. Whenever I talk about this movie, I always find myself then mentioning the documentary Up the Yangtze, which has nothing to do with the film, but which is interesting because it shows people living through a rapidly changing China, particularly around the construction of the Three Gorges Dam. It's one of China's most enormous economic projects, but it also dramatically affected the lives of many people in negative ways. So something else to watch, but let's move on, otherwise this video is going to be 10 hours long. Another movie I would highly recommend watching is Prince of Broadway, directed by Sean Baker, who made many more popular films, Anora, The Florida Project, just to mention a few, but unfortunately often goes completely unnoticed. It's filmed right on the streets of New York using real people instead of professional actors, which is a typical Sean Baker trademark, and it follows a man who suddenly finds himself having to look after a baby after a woman claims it's his. She literally drops the baby into his hands and he has to figure out how to survive while continuing his various jobs, some of them not exactly legal. And while I'm here, I'll actually recommend another Sean Baker film set right in the heart of New York, which is Takeout. This film is so realistic that they filmed sequences of it literally inside a Chinese takeaway restaurant during normal opening working hours. It follows an undocumented Chinese immigrant who has to make an enormous amount of money to repay the people who smuggled him into America, so he's desperately trying to make enough money and time. I mean, I love Sean Baker, and if you want a more in-depth analysis of all his films, I actually made a full ranking of all of them on the channel. I'll leave it linked. And while I'm speaking of rankings, I also recently made a Bong Joon-ho one, and one of his films I think deserves way more recognition is his debut film Barking Dogs Never Bite, which talks about a man dealing with his neighbour's noisy dogs in his own very questionable way. It's nowhere near as famous as other Bong movies like Parasite, The Host, or Mickey 17, but I always find debut films interesting because you can see where a director's career eventually went, while also spotting their quirks and trademarks right from the beginning, and this movie already has so many of them. By the way, in that same ranking, while talking about Parasite and the death of Lee Sung-kyun, I mentioned A Hard Day, which is not a Pong movie, but I think fits perfectly on today's list. It's about a hit and run that leads to an absolutely insane story full of twists and turns and dark humour. Highly recommended. Another underrated film by a famous director is A Hero by Asghar Farhadi, who with a separation made a marriage story look like a middle school play. Anyway, A Hero is a lesser known film of his, but which I think is incredibly interesting and once again has excellent storytelling that keeps you completely hooked. It's about a man who is temporarily released from prison, but during that short period of freedom, everything spectacularly goes wrong through an increasingly complicated chain of events. Next is a South African movie, Tsotsi, which I was mind blown to discover isn't as famous as I thought. I genuinely thought this was film school essential viewing kind of film. I mean, it won an Oscar for Best International Feature. Maybe it just got lost along the way after that. This movie won me over from the opening pounding sequence. It's the story of a young boy, Tsotsi, living in poverty in Johannesburg, South Africa. He's involved in crime with a gang of other young people, and through a series of circumstances, he ends up on the run with a tiny 3-month-old baby, which he obviously has absolutely no idea how to look after. This film keeps you hooked right until the end. I still genuinely don't understand why it isn't talked about as much as other films like City of God, Slumdog Millionaire. But then again, I think that I feed my own algorithm and interest so much that I believe that certain things are so much more universally popular than they really are. I only very recently discovered that Lars von Trier's Nymphomaniac isn't actually universally famous as I thought it was. Another movie I thought was way more famous than it is Kokuho, which is Japan's highest grossing live action film ever. That's how big it is. Yet, for example, here, there were 2 screenings, literally 2 screenings, and I haven't really heard that many people discuss about it, except for in relation to the Oscars, because it was nominated for Best Hairstyle and Makeup. But it's a beautiful movie, so definitely watch it if you can. It's about a boy from a crime family who ends up living under the wing of a famous theatre actor and training alongside the actor's son. It opens up questions about nature versus nurture, and whether coming from an artistic family automatically makes you more talented than someone from the outside world. The visuals are so intense and and beautiful that you genuinely feel like you're sitting in a theatre audience watching their performances. And continuing with Japanese films, it's time to mention Sion Sono, as he's become a bit of a household name here, as my boyfriend, who is way more knowledgeable about this director than me, keeps on telling me I should watch Antiporno and other films of his. He says he knows that I'm going to like them. I have seen Suicide Club and I absolutely loved it, but the two films I want to mention today are different: A Whispering Star and Guilty of Romance. The Whispering Star is basically the answer to how movies are made today for people who can't go for more than 30 seconds without a cut, otherwise their hand itches to get their phone. This film is black and white, barely no dialogue, it's slow paced, it's set in a future where humans live scattered across different planets and a robot woman travels between them making deliveries. The film explores what people consider important enough to have transported all the way across space, even when it takes an incredibly long time to arrive, as well as what human life has become when we're spread across all these different worlds. His other film, Guilty of Romance, instead is completely different. It's about a woman who tries to escape her unhappy, monotonous marriage to become a nude model, but this drags her into an underground world involving crime, murder, prostitution, abuse. Basically, up until now, I haven't seen a bad Sion Sono movie, and I'm looking forward to watch more of his work. Next is Transamerica, which isn't exactly a masterpiece, but it has a soft spot in my heart because it's one of the films that I would borrow for free from the library back in middle school, early high school, when I was first getting into my, let's call it, cinephile journey. Obviously, what was available at the time for free at the local library was very indie, and also this was one of my very first encounters with the topic of being transgender, or even many concepts around their sexuality. Keep in mind, I was a teenager in the early 2000s in a small town in Italy. I couldn't even possibly conceptualize the idea of a vaginoplasty or a man going with another man in a truck stop. It was a pretty wild experience for me. Looking back at it now with an adult perspective, the movie is a lot less shocking than I remembered, and it's actually quite a touching story about a parent and child trying to reconnect. I've also seen more recent discussions saying that parts of the film are dehumanizing towards trans people. One thing is for sure, this film could never be made in exactly the same way today, but it got people talking, and I think it's still an interesting film to watch and discuss from different perspectives. Another film I'm surprised didn't get much traction is The Reluctant Fundamentalist, starring Riz Ahmed. Now, Riz Ahmed has often starred in films which talk about trying to balance the concept of being a Muslim in the Western world, trying to balance these two sides of his identity. For example, in Mogu Mowgli, he plays a young British rapper who in England is seen primarily as Pakistani, while within his Pakistani family and community, he's considered too westernized, simultaneously feeling connected to and alienated from both sides. In Four Lions, which is an extremely dark comedy, he plays a member of an unlikely group of wannabe terrorists in the UK who have all these plans against England while also being basically more British than me. And in Road to Guantanamo, he is detained and interrogated, with a film raising the question of whether his behaviour was actually suspicious in the first place. His short film The Long Goodbye, which won the Oscar, imagines an England where people are subjected to Nazi-style roundups in their own homes by people carrying out what they believe to be justice, and these ideas return in The Reluctant Fundamentalist, in which he portrays a perfectly normal man living in New York until 9/11 happens. Suddenly the way people see and treat him begins to change, and it becomes this kind of endless cycle. I do something harmful to you, so you respond by doing something harmful to me, and the cycle continues. A friend of mine actually wanted to lend me the book on which it's based, so I should get back to her on this. And continuing on the topic of my search for happiness that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, that struggle to balance the bittersweetness of life, comes also the topic of life flying by, understanding your parents' struggles for you as a kid, seeing people around you grow old, balancing different parts of your identity. And a film that touches on all of this is Riceboy Sleeps, which I was so annoyed didn't get any of the attention it deserved. I remember back in the day writing to the director, who had something like 3,000 followers, I think he still has, to compliment him on this film. I can't believe it. Please go watch this film. Riceboy Sleeps tells the story of an immigrant single mother in Canada who's struggling to make ends meet while also trying to maintain her own culture and pass it on to her son. At the same time, she's trying to deal with the fact that her son feels isolated and bullied because of things like having different food at school or a foreign name, and all of these ideas evolve as the son grows up. And a similar new movie, which for now is a hidden gem, but I think will get more interest as it becomes more widely available, is Blue Heron, which I've talked about quite a lot on my channel recently. It follows a Hungarian family who already have to deal with all the issues with relocating to a new country, to Canada, but also struggling with the increasingly concerning behaviour of their teenage son, all seen through the eyes of the youngest daughter. We also see how her perception of events and her opinion of her parents' approach changes as she grows up. Next, on a completely different tone, I'm going to mention Soft and Quiet, but do not Google anything about this film because it's best when you don't know anything about what's going on. Stylistically, the film was shot through what feels like one continuous take. They basically filmed the whole thing 4 times without stopping and then constructed the final version from these extremely long takes, which creates an incredibly nerve-wracking, constant sense of tension. It starts with a school teacher organising a meeting with other women. That's all I'm going to say. Don't you dare Google it before watching it. And another film I think you should not Google before watching it is Tyrannosaur, which actually one of you recommended to me years ago. I loved it, and so I'm passing the beacon on. It stars Peter Mullen and Olivia Colman as respectively a violent and tormented man and the kind woman who warms up to him. But as I said, don't Google this film because there is much more going on. I trusted you when you recommended it to me, so let's keep this chain going. Then a few months back, when I was reviewing a film on the channel, Saccharine, I brought up a film which I said would be something I would recommend more to watch, and that is Dumplings. It deals with a very difficult topic, but I think it's an interesting watch with how our world currently is, in which beauty isn't any longer about health, but it's become basically doing anything, even the most extreme, just to fit into some sort of standard. As a matter of fact, in Dumplings, the protagonist provides a certain thing for women to consume in order to remain beautiful, which I wouldn't be shocked to hear if somebody in the show business today was revealed to be doing the same. Now, would it even be one of my videos if I didn't mention Funny Pages? I've quoted this film so many times on my channel because I love films that have people who look real. They live in real houses, they do regular jobs, they sweat. When was the last time you saw a film in which people sweat and it didn't have a sexual connotation? Anyway, Funny Pages follows an aspiring cartoonist trying to find his place in the world, which leads him to a series of very unexpected experiences and meeting unexpected people, including trying to bond with a more experienced cartoonist. Next come a couple of Indian movies. I'm pretty sure that somewhere on my channel there is an old video in which I cover Indian movies, even more famous ones, up until that point when I made it, but these are 2 lesser known films and which also completely defy the stereotypes and expectations that we have in the Western world towards Indian movies. The first is Super Deluxe, which is probably one of the most quoted Indian movies on my channel. It's a visually stunning story in which the lives of several very different people intertwine: a father who returns to his family as a trans woman, a preacher, a woman cheating on her husband, a group of friends getting together to watch a porn movie, and several other characters who somehow all become connected. And the other film I wanted to mention is Andhadhun, another film which goes against the stereotypes of what we envision in the West of Indian movies, and it is the story of a man who pretends to be blind but ends up, let's say, witnessing a crime. The problem is that in that moment only he knows he actually saw it, but he then ends up being dragged into a criminal situation he never intended to be a part of, and it all escalates from his original decision to just pretend to be blind. Now, moving along the list, the next movie is Gabrielle, which deals with asserting your own dignity, resisting infantilization while living with a disability. It's about wanting autonomy, wanting to love and have relationships, including sexual relationships, while also balancing the concerns of carers about safety and other issues. It also explores topics I hadn't even really thought about before, such as people casually throwing out there the concept of sterilizing disabled women to avoid them getting pregnant without even possibly considering the ethical implications of that. But another interesting film on the list is Sovereign, which I actually put in my best films of 2025 ranking. I don't know how I came across this film. I think I was just intrigued by the poster, and trust your gut feeling about posters, because I remember being intrigued by the poster for Sorry Baby and loving it so much, even without knowing all the hype surrounding it. Anyway, Sovereign is the unfortunately true story of a man living as a sovereign citizen, so basically believing that certain rules, laws and norms don't apply to him. Sometimes I can kind of understand the original logic behind some of these thoughts, but then it usually ends up leading to scams, conspiracy theories, petty protests. And in this particular film, the man's beliefs increasingly affect the life of his young son, who obviously has absolutely no choice in any of this and is simply thrown into the chaos of his father's life until everything eventually gets out of control. Now, living in Italy, I have seen many films which I believe deserve more recognition. They're genuinely better than some Hollywood movies out there. They just don't really make it abroad, except for There's Still Tomorrow, Io Capitano, or the Sorrentino films, which make it to the awards season. I also think that there is this general conception outside of Italy that here films are just pizza, Naples, seaside, or Roberto Benigni films. So I'm going to mention just a few underrated films, but to not go too long, there is a full list on my channel. I will leave that video linked so you can get more information. Now, if you want to get something super cult indie, I would recommend Meri per sempre a ragazzi fuori, both directed by Marco Risi. I actually originally saw these when my boyfriend showed them to me in Palermo for a full, truly immersive experience. We then even saw one of the actors and met and spoke to one of the actors of the films in those same days. Both films tell stories from the streets of Palermo involving queer identity, poverty, prison, the mafia, and simply trying to enjoy your youth. I just know that if these were modern American projects, A24 or Neon would have loved to get their hands on them. Instead, if you want to watch something that will make you feel disgusted to the core with tough subjects, Bad Tales Favolacce does exactly that. The comment section under the trailer has been deactivated. I'll just leave you to watch it and discover what it's all about. For horror fans, Italy is finally digging itself out of this hell of bad productions with directors such as Paolo Stripoli. He directed Piove, about something ominous in the waters in Rome, La Valle dei Sorrisi, about a gym teacher who is hired to work in a remote town where everybody is suspiciously always happy. But that's just a taste of a few interesting Italian films. I will leave the link to the full video. Now, getting back to the main video, there are other films that I was debating whether to fully include in this video or not. Maybe they're not on the same level. Who knows, maybe in the future, if I make another one of these videos, they might be included. So I'm just going to quickly rattle them off. So we have A Small Engine Repair, about three old friends who get together for one evening and things spiral completely out of control. A Prayer Before Dawn is based on the true story of a British man incarcerated in a Thai prison who ends up fighting Muay Thai tournaments. Piercing stars Christopher Abbott as a man who arrives at a hotel room intending to orchestrate a murder, but the situation develops very differently from what he expected. Krisha is one of ye olde A24 films about a woman returning to her family for Thanksgiving, which spirals completely out of control. Rotting in the Sun is about a filmmaker going through an existential crisis until he meets an influencer who drags him into a completely chaotic adventure. Compliance is based on a true story about a fast food employee who receives an unexpected phone call and is asked to perform a series of tasks. Sorry We Missed You, about the struggles of a man trying to make ends meet by becoming a delivery driver. Puzzle with the late Irfan Khan is a quiet film about two people bonding over an unexpected passion for puzzles. But for now, I think we've reached the end of today's video. First of all, if you're still watching, thank you so much. Second of all, I would now love to hear what you think about these titles and what you consider some incredibly underrated films. Let me know everything with a comment down below. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to subscribe and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.